second discussant, Bob Groves. Dr. Groves is provost at Georgetown University and was director of the Census Bureau from 2009 to 2012. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences and winner of numerous awards in the fields of survey research. He was a Morris Hansen co-lecturer in 2011 and is a former guard of the Vermont State Prison.
Well, it's great to be here and see what developed to be a big crowd. So this is the first time I've worked with you. I'm really privileged to be here for the reasons that Ivan has already articulated in better words than I can form. I urge you in an odd moment when you have nothing to do to go through the list of lectures in this series. They have been contributions, I think, to our understanding. They tend to be, like Steve's, big in scope, almost always thought-provoking, and they read well even now, so I urge you to take advantage of that. A few things about Steve. You know, they're in English, the word lecture is both a noun and a verb, so I went to a lecture today, and my mother lectured me. A little of both apply to Steve's remarks. They have different connotations, but over his career, we need to note, and I'm happy to note, that urging, that probing, that niggling of the federal statistical system has produced good things, thought-provoking change as nurtured by his remarks, and I think the ingredients are there in today's talk as well. So it's fitting, and I congratulate the committee that he be chosen as this year's Hansen lecturer. It fits beautifully. Like Ivan, it's impossible to discuss this talk. You'd like to discuss every point on every slide. Each of the points would generate, especially in a bar, long discussions. And knowing that I would follow both Steve and Ivan, I've limited my remarks to 6 slides. So first, I want to make a point that I feel strongly about, and one that I think is key to the eventual societal acceptance of radical change, and that is to acknowledge that we approach censuses from a particular perspective that actually isn't shared very widely. So I, for decades, and still do, think of the census as a statistical exercise that evokes a particular perspective on every aspect of it. And it is that well articulated by Steve, where you start thinking about the interplay of different kinds of errors, both systematic and variable errors, but also the role of cost in their relationships with those errors, that trade-off of cost and quality. And that's particularly fine. It's a cohesive perspective. You can deduce ways forward with that perspective. But for the large majority of the people who are not in this auditorium today, that is not how they think about it. And there are a set of people who are very important to the funding of every census around the world whose opinions and perspective on the census is important. And in this country, the reallocation of political power that goes on through the reapportionment of the House of Representatives is a key feature. There, the qualities, I think, that are important in deciding whether a census is useful for that purpose are really non-statistical. I remind us we have one decade, 1920, where the census was rejected as a tool for reapportionment. It was not a debate about the quality of the census at all that led to that rejection. But nonetheless, that census was rejected for its primary purpose. So here, issues of perceived fairness, perceived competency, competence on the part of the conductors of the census, and issues of transparency, I think, are most important. So this doesn't acknowledge, this perspective doesn't acknowledge many of the base assumptions of the statistical properties of a census. On the second perspective, we haven't figured out a way to ask a question that's related to some of Ivan's remarks, and that is, for that purpose, how good does it have to be? It's tough to have a societal discussion on that. If you look at how we accept the results of voting, based sometimes on less than half of the electorate, and apply that kind of standards of thinking with regard to the reapportionment of the House, you would come to very different conclusions about how good does it have to be politically, societally legitimized. But it's important for us to keep track of that, of those two perspectives. Now, Steve at the end, and Ivan also, has emphasized, I think, this latter point. There's a particular audience for this latter point. It involves all our fellow citizens, but especially 435 people who work down the street. And they are a key audience with regard to navigating these two perspectives. So let me now move to why I take as my key source of commentary Steve's point about let's do it in reverse. Let's start with people and then end up building up aggregations of people, families, households, then place them in space. So let's talk about why you would even think about that. This is somewhat redundant, but it's important to realize why this is even worth talking about. We do have problems because of societal change and actually the results of Census Bureau inquiries that tell us that the basic concept of the household is frayed at the edges. People have multiple residences. They're members, as Steve notes, of multiple households. There's a lot of loose residential connections, especially among the young. And then finally, and I feel this viscerally now after going through the 2010 census, it is really quite difficult to determine, based on visual cues, the relationship between people, families, and households, even if you're there on site. So one of the great sets of examples, analyses drilling into the 2010 census, I think, were illuminated how if you sent different people to the same unit repeatedly, they would come up with quite logically but very different outcomes of what's going on in that structure with regard to number of residences. So that concept itself is fraying at the edges. Secondly, and I'm sort of with Steve on this, it isn't clear what the Postal Service would be. I know that Ivan was going to mention the Canadian example of mail not being delivered, I believe, to households in Canada. This is a harbinger of this country. So leaning on the Postal Service as the mainstay of an address-based frame, I think, is different. This attaches to a different debate that Steve didn't mention, and that is why have we kept this map a Census Bureau product only, and why haven't we democratized it to create a public resource that is continuously updated through all of the devices that Steve mentioned in a more public and open way. And the third point is I think we have enough evidence to say if you're a student of PESs and you look at the evaluation over time, we're plateauing. We're not getting really better with whatever you want to call the traditional census or from the basic evaluative data from from the post-enumeration survey, there isn't strong evidence that each decade we're getting better. Let me continue. Other attractions. We do have some advances on record matching, and actually the rate of advance is itself increasing, I think, mainly because of all the work going on, not just in the federal statistical system, but in other domains with record matching. So maybe we have some new tools. A lot of those records are person-based. A lot of them are digital data. The census match study that Steve mentioned played with certain commercial data sets. It didn't touch other things. It didn't touch other records about people, and it didn't touch that are internet-based like Facebook and Twitter, and basically IP identified data sets, and it didn't touch the mobile cellular data in ways that might be useful, especially enhanced with GPS-based geocoding. And then sixth and final, I think, as Steve outlined, the assumptions underlying the PES, the notion that you could use basically the same tool on a sample basis, a self-report survey, in order to measure the quality of a census, has within it certain challenges with regard to assumption. These can be portrayed either as statistical problems or really logical problems. So how can you use basically the same tool in order to measure how good another tool is? So those are the plus sides on a person-based census. Let's talk about the unsolved problems. And all of these, I think, can be found in Steve's talk. One is the impact on legitimacy of the absence of a universal frame. Like the math or not like the math, it gives that benchmark that is the comparison base. Starting with people and then building households still begs the question of whether we would have some sort of benchmark to sit at. Work needs to be done. I'm pleased to hear the work that CMU is doing, but much more needs to be done on relationships of these different indexing systems. Mobile phone numbers, IP addresses, housing units, people. How do they relate, and how do those relations vary over subsets of the population? We've got a lot of work to do on this. It's tough work because it's going to change every year as these systems change, but we need to do it. And as he noted, the current findings on comparing digitized data relevant to persons to census has one striking result to me, and that is that the kinds of people that we tend to miss in traditional censuses, whatever you think about that, the kinds of people that are hardest to bring in a traditional census are exactly the kinds of people who aren't on these person lists that have been examined. So it could be that thinking about censuses with heavy administrative record bases should acknowledge that we still have a coverage problem to deal with for those folks that are not on the records, and keen on that is important. 3, the assignment of people to space. We clearly need new rules on this score. Steve proposes fractional assignment. If I have a house in Washington, D.C. and another house in Florida, I assume I self-report fraction of time. Clearly, with an increasing ability to surveil the population, those could be empirically based. You could imagine if you had mobile phone data on everyone, you really could assign people to place, or at least phone to place in a much more continuous way. It brings to mind the old debate we've had about de facto versus de jure assignment of people. We use a census that fixes people in space by their self-report of where they usually live. There's nothing in the Constitution that requires that exactly. Steve, by the way, de-emphasized a clause at the end of Article 1, Section 2. It says an actual enumeration, but it says in a manner that Congress so shall by law direct. We got to hang on that clause because they have great freedom to set this. And then the evaluation of coverage. No matter what we do, especially if we build an estimation to the overall pop counts through some magic of congressional permission, we still have to sell the estimation process, not just to us, but to the public, and I think that's Ivan's point. So what are the practical ways to make progress? I would urge all of us to acknowledge, first of all, these different perspectives, and to acknowledge the people that hold the purse strings and determine the public image of the Census Bureau are not taking the statistical viewpoint. We have to acknowledge that. We need to address them. I, like Ivan, believe that more attention to cost savings by us is the route to more attention by those folks. And by addressing cost savings, we can begin to talk about quality at the same moment. So I would engage Congress now, easy for me to say. How you do that, none of us have magical solutions, I think, for this, but it's incumbent on us to do that. Now, most of Steve's remarks were written, I think, before NSA happened, maybe not. I really do think the pre-NSA world and the post-NSA world are completely different worlds for this country. We don't know it yet, but it will happen. So this last bullet point is an attempt at humor. It seems to me we either have to actively differentiate what we're doing with regard to records from NSA, and the or take advantage of the fact that all of you in this room and everybody in the United States thinks that the NSA is measuring us perfectly all the time, each and every one of us, and knows exactly where we are, and then subcontract the census to the NSA. They have greater legitimacy on their coverage. So I thank you very much. I thank Steve for this wonderfully thoughtful talk.